Speaker, by now everybody in this House and beyond are well aware of the crisis facing the planet with respect to the plague of plastic in our oceans. It's a concern of all of us. Soon we could see plastic outweigh fish. I have risen in the House on numerous occasions to urge the government to act in response to a spill of 35 shipping containers from a Korean tanker off the coast of Vancouver Island from last November. 7 months has now passed, and although a small contribution has been made to reimburse the partial costs by the Pacific Rim chapter of Surfrider, one of the community organizations that mobilized its members to respond to this travesty, no other effective action has been taken. The government tells us that it's doing all it can and working with communities to recover the vast quantities of styrofoam used to line the containers, long since broken up into small pieces and carried with the tides and currents onto our precious beaches. But those who are out on the beaches are telling us that the government has been invisible. In fact, the government's reaction has been neither rapid nor responsive. It collected $72,000 from the bankrupt shipping company and waited for 6 months before allocating less than a quarter of the total to one of the volunteer organizations that's been doing the work. Needless to say, the impact of this container spill has consequences for the local population. It's food security. The Pacific Rim relies heavily on this region, on the pristine coast for its economy, jobs, the ecosystem, and the species that are at risk. This region relies heavily on tourism, as we know, and the Prime Minister knows well, and many of this members of the House know as well. Increasingly, I am receiving images, photos, and videos of the situation, along with media reporting on both the damage and the courage and hard work of local First Nations, Surfrider, Wild Pacific Trail Society, Clackwood Cleanup, and other dedicated local groups and Canadians who have taken to the beaches. The message from these groups and my own voice and the voices of others across the country and around the world seem to be falling on deaf ears. Madam Speaker, we need a proper response plan to remove the tons of marine debris along the coastline of Vancouver Island. We need a plan that sets out the activities required to achieve common sense outcomes, that provides for the safety of those doing the work and for the disposal of massive amounts of debris. Second, we need a policy to address spills like this in the future. It needs to be clear about the roles of local people using local knowledge and community resources to remove marine debris. And it needs to be developed with the lessons learned by internationally countries that have best practices. Third, we need a funding formula that accurately calculates the resources, the funds and the source of funds that must be allocated to support the work of cleanup in an efficient and effective manner. And fourth, we need a public education program that informs Canadians about what is happening to our oceans and the peril of single-use plastics, the consequences of using styrofoam and shipping containers, and multiple other risks to our oceans. Madam Speaker, the government needs to tell this House about its plan of action for removing marine debris that is being deposited on the shores of Vancouver Island before it can cause further damage. We want to know what their plan of action is. I also do want to thank the government and appreciate the government for their response to my concerns about its omission of the west coast of Vancouver Island on the list of priorities identified in the minister's announcement of the Coastal Restoration Fund last week. I very much appreciate the addition of our coast to this list. It's certainly better late than never. I would like to know as well as cleaning up and removing marine debris and plastics eligible under this Coastal Restoration Fund, and if so, when will the resources required to support their work be available? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. I was born just outside the member opposite's riding and caught my first fish, a rainbow trout, when I was 5 or 6 in his riding. So it is a pleasure to be here today to discuss a topic for which we are both passionate. The Government of Canada is committed to protecting our coasts and oceans and keeping them healthy for future generations. We have recently announced a number of funding commitments, including $123.7 million over 5 years to support marine conservation activities, $197.1 million over 5 years to increase ocean and freshwater science, and a $1.5 billion National Ocean Protections Plan that improves marine safety and protects Canada's marine environment. Marine litter poses a threat to marine ecosystems. With the longest coastline in the world and bordering 3 oceans, Canada recognizes the importance of preventing and reducing marine litter to keep our oceans healthy. While there is no overarching federal marine litter framework, some 10 federal acts and associated regulations, as well as guidance materials and programs for pollution prevention, are aimed at the sustainable use of Canadian waters and habitat. In particular, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999, Canada Shipping Act, and Great Lake Water Quality Agreement prohibit discharge or disposal of marine litter in Canadian waters. The Fisheries Act prohibits the deposit of harmful substances into domestic waters frequented by fish and prohibits serious harm to fish and fish habitat. The Species at Risk Act contains a provision for the protection of critical habitat for listed species, which can include the marine environment for aquatic species at risk. Now, we acknowledge that there is more to be done to address marine litter. International collaboration is needed to address hotspot areas, fill research gaps, and to take action to prevent this global issue. Canada is an active participant in global efforts that contribute to the prevention and reduction of marine litter from land and sea-based sources. Canada has made recent marine debris commitments, including, among others, the G7 Environmental Ministers Communique 2016 and the United Nations Environment Assembly Resolutions 2016 and 2014. These commitments call for action to prevent and mitigate marine debris and to substantially reduce marine debris globally by 2025. In addition, Canada will continue to fulfill its obligations under international treaties that deal with waste and marine protection, particularly the Basel Convention, International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, and the London Convention and Protocol. The federal government also conducts extensive research and monitoring on issues related to water quality, sediment, chemicals, and issues of emerging concern. ECCC's Canada Wildlife Service conducts research and administers guidance to help aid seabirds that are at risk of ingesting or getting entangled in marine debris. Internationally, Canada participates via DFO in international regional marine research and science programs, including the North Pacific Marine Science Organization and the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas. In June 2016, the Government of Canada added microbeads to the list of toxic substances under the Canadian Environmental Protections Act 1999, and Canada is developing proposed regulations to prohibit the manufacture, import, and sale of toiletries that contain plastic microbeads, including non-prescription drugs and natural health projects. We expect final regulations to be published summer of 2017. The Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup, which is supported by Parks Canada, is one of Canada's largest environmental initiatives. In 2015 alone, almost 60,000 participants cleaned over 3,000 kilometers of shoreline across the country, removing an incredible 180,000 kilograms of litter. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Courtenay Albany.
Madam Speaker, I really appreciate the Government of Canada signing on to international treaties, but the problem is, Madam Speaker, is they're missing in action. It's great to talk about an ocean protection plan and $1.5 billion, but when a spill happens, a marine debris spill like we've seen on the magnitude that we are seeing on Vancouver Island, and the government's invisible, it's really hard for the, people to have any credibility with the Government of Canada and their ocean protection plan. I asked the member point blank, is ocean plastics and marine debris eligible under the Coastal Restoration Fund? And people would like to know. And I'd like to get a commitment from the member that we're going to bring together stakeholders so that we can find a way forward. And it's not just about signing treaties. It's actually about doing something about it and having real action.
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Government of Canada is committed to protecting our coasts and oceans and keeping them healthy for future generations. Canada is an active participant in global efforts that contribute to the prevention and reduction of marine litter from land and sea-based sources. The first UN Oceans Conference concluded last week, and Canada joined many countries in pledging to take action to protect our oceans. As part of the over 1,000 voluntary commitments by participants, Canada committed to join the UN Clean Seas campaign. This campaign will raise awareness and mobilize actions to address marine pollution. Plastics are of a particular concern, as they are now showing up in the most remote areas, including the Arctic Ocean. Marine litter poses a threat to marine ecosystems. The longest coastline in the world and bordering 3 oceans, Canada recognizes the importance of preventing and reducing marine litter to keep our oceans healthy for the benefit of future generations. Thank you, Madam Speaker.